a native Prussian named Gottfried Ewart, was supposed to be drafted into military service in the fall of 1940. Upon reaching the age of majority, namely 18 years old, however, due to the start of large-scale and bloody military operations that engulfed almost the entire territory of Europe, he was drafted early, or to be more precise, in December 1939. He had to take a direct part in the French campaign, which was conducted by the Wehrmacht. But, to his great surprise, no serious or significant combat engagements took place there. Instead, they spent most of their time making long and tedious moves along roads, both on foot and by bicycle, constantly lagging behind the rapidly and relentlessly advancing motorized units. It was, without a doubt, a truly crazy and absurd undertaking. A war that ended with amazing and lightning speed. In January 1941, Ewart was sent to a military school located in the city of Potsdam. There he completed an intensive 5-month training course, after which, in May, already with the rank of lieutenant, he returned to his home regiment, where he was entrusted with the command of an entire infantry platoon. He went through all the horrors and hardships of the war as part of this very regiment. During his long service, he was wounded 7 times, but each time he persistently and insistently returned to duty to continue fighting. He left his regiment only in the fall of 1944 after receiving a severe and serious leg wound during fierce fighting in Courland, which marked the end of his military career. Like many other Wehrmacht veterans, Gottfried recalls with clear excitement that on the eve of June 22, 1941, there were a huge number of different, sometimes contradictory rumors and speculations. In particular, among the soldiers, there were talks that the Soviet Union might provide passage through the Caucasus to allow the German army to pass into Persia in order to strike a crushing blow against the British together with Germany. Another version was also actively discussed about a possible attack on the Soviet Union. But this idea seemed completely absurd and nonsensical to many. After all, how can you fight with such a huge, powerful, and boundless country, especially since there was a non-aggression pact concluded earlier between Germany and the USSR? Despite all these rumors and doubts, at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning they began their offensive, moving out of the Krumbach forest, which was located on the very border between Prussia and Lithuania. Their entire company moved on bicycles, as the rich experience gained during the French campaign had shown that this was a very effective and fast means of transportation in combat situations. We ask you to take a little of your precious time and subscribe to our channel, and also not forget to leave a like so as not to miss many interesting, exciting, and informative stories about the events of World War II, as well as to learn the opinions and points of view of participants from different sides of this bloody conflict. The first days of the war were marked by endless journeys, tedious relocations, and grueling marches, which ultimately forced the command to completely abandon the further use of bicycles, as there were practically no suitable roads for them anywhere. In the realities of the Soviet Union, waging war by relying on rapid movement on bicycles turned out to be completely impossible and a failed plan. The first combat contact with the enemy occurred with Soviet border guards who were on duty at the border outpost, having taken up defenses in prepared and carefully equipped trenches, put up stubborn and very staunch resistance to the advancing enemy units. But unfortunately, the forces were far from equal, and their resistance was suppressed in the shortest possible time, practically without any chance of success. It was at this moment that the first personnel losses appeared as well as the first prisoners of war captured in battle. Despite the fierce and stubborn resistance offered by the Soviet border guards, on the first day of the invasion, the regiment was able to advance 30 kilometers into the territory of Lithuania. However, on the same day, the regiment suffered heavy and irreparable losses, losing as many as 5 officers, which was an absolutely unprecedented case in the entire history of the regiment. Then they had to storm the well-fortified concrete bunkers of the fortified area, where Russian soldiers had taken up defenses, Although the fortified area itself had not yet been completely completed and ready for defense, the Russian soldiers held their positions extremely steadfastly and stubbornly, unwilling to retreat, and the regiment again suffered very significant losses. But after the successful European campaigns, all German soldiers had developed a strong habit of always winning. They were completely confident in their strength and did not for a second allow the thought of a possible defeat or any other outcome of the battle other than victory. On the third day of the war, intensive counterattacks by Soviet tank units began. The huge KV-2 tanks caused especially great damage to the German infantry. They seemed absolutely invincible and indestructible. But fortunately for the Germans, these tanks were too heavy, clumsy, and slow, and therefore often got stuck in swamps and off-road terrain and constantly broke down. It was this sad fate that befell as many as 2 KV-2 tanks which Gottfried's regiment had to face. The heaviest and fiercest battles unfolded for the bridges that were located near Riga. In the end, the retreating Russian soldiers, not wanting to leave the bridges intact, blew them up, and it was not possible to capture them intact. During the assault on Riga, Gottfried's company suffered heavy losses, losing all the remaining officers in the ranks, both killed in battle and seriously wounded. Ewart, despite his youth, inexperience, and lack of combat experience, was appointed commander of the company, but after a few days, he himself was seriously wounded by shrapnel from a hand grenade that was thrown at him. In the hospital, which was located in the city of Shalai, he underwent several rather complex and lengthy operations, and already in August he returned to his home regiment and immediately resumed his duties. Initially, it was assumed that the enemy's resistance would gradually wane and subside, but to the great surprise of the German soldiers, on the contrary, it only increased, becoming more and more fierce and stubborn. Ewart was very lucky that at the very moment when their division came under a fierce and unexpected counterattack near Solzhenitsyn, he was in the hospital for treatment in those fierce battles. The German army suffered very heavy losses, and following these tragic events, a serious and thorough investigation was conducted. Gottfried does not remember a single case during the entire war when Russian soldiers surrendered in an organized way, in entire units with their officers, but in the course of constant and fierce battles, quite a lot of prisoners were taken. There were also constantly individual defectors who voluntarily, on their own initiative, switched to their side, saving their lives. When the Russian army began to achieve tangible success on the front, the total number of defectors, of course, decreased significantly, but they still continued to appear practically until the very end of the war. This was because they were very frightened, as they saw with their own eyes and knew what colossal and irreparable losses their troops were suffering during constant attacks, and they were simply desperately afraid for their lives. But there was also one defector the other way around who defected to the enemy's side. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, one soldier from Ewart's company voluntarily defected to the side of the Russians. It turned out that he was a long-time and convinced supporter of the Communist Party of Germany, but carefully concealed his political beliefs from all his comrades. One day, he simply disappeared without a trace, and then German soldiers began to receive leaflets with his appeals and addresses to them. In August, they managed to capture Novgorod and were supposed to advance further east. However, the plans of the command suddenly changed, and they went along the Fokhof River and the main road to the north. Towards Chadovo, where very close to Kurishi, they were finally stopped. At this section of the front, they had to get stuck for a very long time. Until the beginning of 1943, they constantly marked time. Without the ability to advance further inland, the Russian soldiers held their defense extremely tenaciously and skillfully, not allowing the enemy to advance a single step. After June 22nd, not a single unit of the German army was ever fully staffed again, as required by the establishment. By the fall, total losses amounted to approximately 2/3 of the total number of troops. Reinforcements, of course, constantly arrived, but they could never fully compensate for the losses incurred, which were simply enormous. With the onset of harsh winter and unbearable frosts, the morale of the soldiers plummeted to a critical level, simply because they, for the most part, did not have winter clothing. When you're constantly freezing, you don't think about the war, but only about how to survive and how to get a little bit warm. The feet were especially cold. Soldiers tried to put paper in their boots to at least warm themselves up a little. The Germans constantly took felt boots from Russian soldiers, and prisoners, they put on everything they could get, any rags, just to escape the deadly cold. Very quickly, they adopted from the Russians the invaluable experience of building a sauna or bathhouse in the field, so that they could wash, warm up, and at least put themselves in order. Only in the second winter, in 1942 to 1943, did the German soldiers finally receive winter clothing and footwear. But it is worth noting that the second winter was no longer as cold and harsh as the previous one. In 1943, they received new weapons, automatic carbines, Sturmgewehr, according to Gottfried Ewart. This was a truly excellent and powerful weapon that significantly increased the combat capabilities of the infantry on the battlefield. They had short cartridges, so each soldier could take more ammunition with him. Positional warfare was characterized by the fact that the soldiers dug trenches on an industrial scale, despite the fact that the terrain was very swampy and unsuitable for building fortifications. Strong bunkers were built from tree trunks, with the walls made of 2 layers of logs, and the space between them was carefully filled with earth. The dugout bunker in which Gottfried Ewart lived was dug directly into the embankment of the Moscow-Leningrad Railway. The Russian soldiers were very brave, resilient, and able to endure enormous suffering. But they also had one very weak point. This was their, to put it mildly, mediocre command. They repeated the same gross mistakes again and again. They constantly went on the offensive in the same small area, on which 3 artillery regiments that had become adept at firing were conducting intense and targeted fire. Naturally, under such conditions, artillery and machine guns simply mowed down their ranks, destroying a huge number of personnel. Gottfried Ewart calls the T-34 tank the most dangerous Russian weapon. For the first time, they saw it with their own eyes in November 1941. This acquaintance was an extremely unpleasant and unexpected surprise, because the German army had absolutely no effective and efficient means against the T-34 tank. In the infantry regiment, there was only 1 platoon of 50mm anti-tank guns, but even they could not penetrate the frontal armor of the T-34 tank. It was a tank that, until 1943, completely surpassed all types of German tanks, including the T-4. This opinion is exclusively that of the hero of the video. It is subjective because, as I said earlier, the T-4 had many modifications, and it is very difficult to say which tank is better. Only the 88mm flak anti-aircraft guns could cope with the T-34 tanks. The infantrymen tried to use T-mines against the T-34 tanks, which they threw onto the engine compartment. Their regiment was one of the first in the Wehrmacht to receive cumulative magnetic mines, which adhered very well to the tank and exploded, burning through the armor with a shaped charge. But the cunning and resourceful Russians very quickly adapted to this tactic and began to coat the tanks with a thick layer of cement. Because of this, magnetic mines simply could not attach to the tank's armor. In 1944, they received Panzerfaust. It was a good and powerful weapon, but only for close combat. Therefore, the Russian tank units also adapted to it very quickly. They tried not to let the enemy get too close to their tanks, stopped at a distance of 100 to 200 meters, and simply shot them from their cannons. It was absolutely impossible to approach them in such conditions. During the retreat, a huge number of anti-tank guns were lost. After all, they were very heavy, and it was impossible to drag them along. If a vehicle broke down or ran out of fuel, they were simply abandoned to their fate. Therefore, in the end, there was practically no long-range anti-tank artillery left, and the Red Army tanks discovered and understood this very quickly. They stopped at a safe distance and simply shot the German infantry with their powerful cannons. The artillery of the Soviet army also fired very accurately and effectively. I was once literally shot out of a bunker. We were sitting in a bunker in the second line. We had already been driven out of the first one. Here, a shell exploded 100 meters in front of us. 2 minutes later, a shell exploded 100 meters behind the bunker. I immediately shouted to my soldiers, "Run away from here!" We jumped out of there like crazy, and the third shell hit exactly our bunker and completely destroyed it. As a result, we were simply taken in a vice, depriving us of any chance of salvation. Ewert recalls with a shudder. Once he himself almost became a tongue, that is, was taken prisoner as a company commander, he walked around the trenches and checked on his subordinates. And when he went to the neighboring post along the communication line, a Russian soldier suddenly attacked him. He tried to grab him, but could not. As Ewert managed to deftly dodge and jump around the corner, the Russian, without losing a second, threw a grenade right at his feet, after which he quickly disappeared, and Gottfried was hospitalized again for a very long time. Goodbye. We were sincerely glad to see you on our channel. Do not forget to write your interesting comments. Be sure to leave likes and subscribe to our channel.